to another edition of the Public Interest. My name is David Granger, and today we'll be looking at the impact of the Haitian Revolution, which occurred in 1791. In fact, it lasted 14 years. It's one of the longest revolutions in the Western Hemisphere. You may not know, and I myself was happy to learn, that the 23rd of August is United Nations International Day for the remembrance of the slave trade and its abolition. Why did the United Nations choose the 23rd of August? It seems to be an odd day, but that day actually was the day of the outbreak of the revolt in Saint-Domingue. Saint-Domingue is the French version of Santo Domingo. Before Haiti became free, it was called Saint-Domingue. And of course, the eastern part of the island is called Santo Domingo. Both of them mean the same thing. But the 23rd of August, 1791, was the day which marked the eruption of the revolution. And it was because, in the eyes of the United Nations and decision makers, that it was decisive. The Haitian Revolution was decisive, pivotal to the abolition of the transatlantic trade in captive Africans. So, in fact, every year, the 23rd of August is observed as the International Day for the Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its abolition. And the United Nations chose the outbreak of the Haitian Revolution. So it is memorialized as a part of world history, not only Caribbean history, but the history of the world. And we must think of that. Why, of all the possible choices, they chose the eruption of the Haitian Revolution for an international day for the remembrance of the slave trade and its abolition. Let us look a little more closely at this phenomenon that we call the Haitian Revolution. Saint-Domingue, as you know, was a French colony, but the revolution that broke out in 1793 was a part of a series of revolutions. In 1700, there was a revolt. In 1724, in 1730, in 1734, 1740, 1750. So when the revolt erupted in 1791, it was not a unique event. It was part of a series of revolts, and enslaved people never accepted slavery, and they would revolt from time to time. Of course, those revolts were suppressed. But when the revolt broke out in 1793, it meant that there was a building up of anger against the planters and against the French. And in fact, the Haitian Revolution turned out to be not one event, but it was a series of insurrections and invasions and revolts and mutinies and warfare. And the revolution began on 22nd, 23rd of August, as you can see, in 1791, and ended 14 years later. And it was complex. It involved persons of different classes. Some were French bureaucrats, some were merchants, some were planters. It involved people of different ethnicities. Some were white, what they call the Blanc, B-L-A-N-C-S. Some were black, they were called it Noir, N-O-I-R. And some were, mixed brown people. I don't know if they call themselves brown, but mulattoes, the French call them mulat. So you had the Blanc, Noir, and Mulat, who were really, the mulattoes were biracial. And they considered themselves different from black people. And of course, the white people considered themselves different from the mulattoes. And it involved different nationalities. Some were English, French, Spanish. And it involved people at different levels of society. Some were still enslaved at the bottom. Some who were previously enslaved had been emancipated. They were called affranchis, people who had been legally emancipated by one means or the other. Maybe the father was a white man and he purchased them. And some were free. So the revolution was a complex mix of class and race and ideology, and this contributed to the prolongation of the struggle. And more or less, it was prolonged too by the fact that it was at the time of the outbreak, it was the richest colony in the world. At the time of the outbreak in 1791, 92, 93, Haiti, or Saint Domingue as it was called, was the richest colony in the world. In fact, it produced greater value, greater volume of cotton, coffee, sugar, and indigo than all the British colonies together in the Caribbean. So it is not something that the French were prepared to ignore. France made money. It re-exported those commodities to the rest of Europe, and it was not prepared to lose the richest part of its empire. Um, the revolution was also influenced by the ideas of a group of people who were called the philosophes. They weren't real philosophers, they were intellectuals in the 18th century. People like Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Voltaire, Denis Diderot, all these were important philosophers who contributed to what is called the Enlightenment. And their ideas were embedded in the French slogan, liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, equality, and brotherhood, whether they lived up to those ideas or not. But that slogan, that motto, liberté, égalité, and fraternité, was embraced by the philosophe, and of course, it inspired some of the white people in Haiti, some of the mulattoes, and all of the black people. They said, oh, we're talking about liberty. Well, they bought into liberty and equality and fraternity. This is what inspired the beliefs of the rebels, and this is what governed the behavior of the rebels, the ideas of the Enlightenment. And you must bear in mind when people speak about political action, those political actions, whether it's communist revolution or French Revolution, whatever it is, these revolutions are guided by ideas. And without ideas, you're just talking about confusion, you're just talking about anarchy. So the ideas of the philosophers, the philosophes, like Rousseau, inspired the people in Haiti, brown, black, and white. Why did the revolution break out? Now, at the start, in the late 18th century, France was bringing in 40,000 captive Africans a year. When you consider that at the time of emancipation in British Guiana, we only had a black population of 85,000. Barbados, similarly, 85,000. French were bringing half that number every year. So that at the time of the outbreak, there was a large number of African-born slaves who outnumbered the local-born, who were called the Creoles. Creole simply means born in the country. And the African-born were called Basel. They were born in Africa and brought. But those who were born in Africa, weren't accustomed to the French way of doing things, and they were more rebellious than the Creoles. The Creoles tended to be a bit conditioned by years of slavery, but the Basels, or those who had recently come off the ships, were not going to put up with the loss of their freedom. So the revolution broke out in August, and it erupted in a place in the north, what is called the Plaine du Nord. And at the start, they were able to mobilize about 100,000 slaves. 100,000. This is without internet, without Facebook, without without cell phones. 100,000 people came to the revolution right away, and very soon it moved south and to the center of Haiti and involved the whole colony. So you can see that the message of freedom, the message of liberty, was able to envelop the entire colony in a very short period of time. And it was a result of that massive organization and mobilization that, Haiti, the revolution in Haiti, which of course had the greatest number of enslaved Africans at that time, was so, took so long and was so cruel. Now, apart from the fact that, either the Bosses or the Creoles were unprepared to accept slavery, there were other factors which influenced the rebels. To start with, the French monarchy, and don't forget that Haiti at that time was a colony of France. The French monarchy collapsed, and we don't need to go into all the reasons at present. We can deal with that another time. But the French king Louis XVI, Louis says, he was broke, and he decided to call what is called the States General. That is a meeting of the royalty, the clergy, and the common people, the three estates. And of course, people later on tended to regard the press as the fourth estate, but there were really three estates. And he decided to summon what they call the État Généraux, the States General. And once he did that, the genie was out of the bottle, or the same West Coast, the Baku got away, and he couldn't get it back in. Now, the people started to question this divine right of kings. Even at the present time, if you look at the British coin, you'd see Queen by the grace of God. Well, people, became very cynical, and they said, the king doesn't rule by the grace of God, and he couldn't adapt to the problems. He couldn't solve the problems of France, problems of financial collapse, of political exclusion, and pressures from society. And he just lost his credibility. And as you know, on the 14th of July, which is the French, that's the French National Day, 14 Juillet, the 14th of July, they stormed the Bastille. And after that, the revolution could not be stopped. In addition to bringing down the royalty, of course, Louis says the king lost his head, they executed him. And the aristocracy also came under attack. And the bourgeoisie, these are the merchants and the civil servants and middle class people, they felt they were being excluded from political power, which they were. And this contributed to the downfall of the royalty and the downfall of the monarchy and the aristocracy. And of course, when Napoleon Bonaparte seized or got into office, he moved from monarchy to autocracy, and he unleashed 2 decades, 20 years of warfare, moving French troops all over Europe, right across Europe to Russia, the peninsula, Spain, to Italy. And he conquered most of Europe until he was stopped at the Battle of Waterloo. And that's what it means, you've met your Waterloo, that's the end of the road for Napoleon. But the aristocracy and royalty were replaced by the autocracy. The aristocracy was replaced by the autocracy. And we cannot underestimate the role of the philosophers, because their ideas inspired the peasants, the poor people. It inspired the bourgeoisie not to accept, the arbitrary rule of royalty, and to have some other form of democratic representation. And that is where we got, even in Ghana, we call our parliament the National Assembly, and that is when the expression was first used, Assemblée Nationale. The National Assembly was convened, and the rebels or the revolutionaries took control because they did away with the royalty, sometimes in a very cruel way. They did away with the aristocracy, and the ordinary people and the philosophers, the commoners, the third estate was in control of the National Assembly. But let's move ahead. There were different factions, of course, in France, and one of them was known as the Jacobins. These were the extreme left-wing people. C.L.R. James wrote a very interesting book called The Black Jacobins, because he compared the rebels in Haiti, the black rebels in Haiti, with the white extremists in France, who were called Jacobins. We'll go into the reason why they call Jacobins some other time. But the Jacobins dominated the National Assembly in France, and they abolished slavery. They sent commissioners into Haiti and abolished slavery in Haiti in 1794. Decades before the Americans, British, Dutch, French, Portuguese, and Spanish abolished slavery. So from 1794, when the revolution had started, the French National Assembly legally abolished slavery. And, it was the first place in the Western Hemisphere to abolish African slavery. Again, that's a good reason why we should observe the 23rd of August as an important day in the freedom of the Western Hemisphere, the people of the Western Hemisphere. Now, in addition to that, we have to look at not only the causes, the resentment, the collapse of the aristocracy and the monarchy, the influence of the philosophers, but France had been involved in trying to undermine the British Empire by participating and supporting the rebels in America. Once the American Revolution started, France spent a lot of money to support the American rebels. And France, those days, most of those European countries were involved in warfare against one another. And as a result of that, France was bankrupted. So King Louis had to attempt to raise money, and that is why he summoned the Estates General, and the Estates General brought him down because they were not going to keep pumping money into overseas military adventures, which were failing. And the people now in Haiti started to correspond with societies in France, in Paris, which influenced the debates in the National Assembly. And, for example, they wanted to represent their own class interests. So you had societies called Société des Amis des Noirs, Society of the Friends of Black People. You had Société Correspondance des Colons Français, society, a society for French settlers, and you had the Society of Colonists and so on. So every group, the mulattoes would be corresponding with the society in Paris to support their views in the National Assembly. The blacks were corresponding with societies in Paris. The whites were corresponding with societies. So everything that was taking place in Haiti was being debated in the National Assembly in Paris, in France. So you can see the complexity. It was not just a local revolt, in which, one side was killing the other side. People were going through the National Assembly in order to bring about changes. And those changes did come out, as I said, in 1794. Slavery was actually abolished. And the Jacobins, the left-wingers, if you want to call it that, I don't like the expression myself, the Jacobins were instrumental in promoting the freedom of the Haitian people. And that's why C.L.R. James's book, The Black Jacobins, is so important. Now, poor Haiti, during the course of the revolution, it was invaded by three of the most powerful maritime European empires, England, France, and Spain. And all three of those empires had property in in the Caribbean, and they did not want to. They didn't invade out of any goodwill towards the rebels. They wanted to suppress the rebellion. They wanted to suppress the revolt, the revolution. And three empires invaded Haiti. This is, I'm not sure any other former colony had such an experience. And each one of those, England, France, and Spain, wanted to restore slavery after it had been abolished by the French National Assembly. And you can understand how profound and how complex the Haitian Revolution is becoming. Now, the planters in the Caribbean were all afraid, those the planters in the slave societies were all afraid of another Haiti. They're all afraid that their own countries, their own colonies would become another Haiti. It was the only time in which enslaved black people and free brown people combined to fight and defeat the English, French, and Spanish. This was rare that that black people and brown people, the mulattoes, actually, but later on they fought among themselves, but actually fought together to drive out the English, French, and Spanish. And bear in mind, this was an age of revolution. Even in Europe, you had revolution in Switzerland, in America, in France, in Belgium, Italy, and Ireland. So let us look a little more closely at the consequences of the Haitian Revolution. To start with, it fractured the foundations on which the transatlantic trade in captive Africans rested. After that, the transatlantic trade was doomed. And after the Haitian Revolution triumphed in 1804, within 4 years, the transatlantic trade, not slavery, the trade was abolished. That was definitely attributable to the Haitian Revolution. The revolution fomented racial tensions among the major maritime empires, England, France, and Spain. And when you consider, the Black Lives Matter movement, you can see that the same countries, were involved, and they still have racial problems. And those racial problems can be traced back, 200 years ago. And that is one of the consequences of the Haitian Revolution, the attempt to suppress the Haitian Revolution. Thirdly, and this may seem to be a bit abstruse, that Haiti, by becoming a state, created a new notion. People in Guyana and Barbados and Jamaica didn't think of statehood. But here it was, a group of black rebels could establish a real country, an independent country. So we need to credit the Haitian Revolution with the giving us this notion of statehood, of nationalism. People never really thought seriously about nationality and pride in the nation. It also showed how, with a bit of organization and mobilization, slaves could defeat European armies. And that was really a very strong statement that, they could do it themselves. And as I said, the success of the Haitian Revolution expedited the abolition of the slave trade and slavery itself. By 1808, slave trade was abolished, and years after that, as we discussed in previous programs, we were able to see that slavery itself, not just the trade, but slavery itself as a system was destroyed in the middle years of the 19th century. And in a way, too, the Haitian Revolution was able to transmit the lessons of the French Revolution, of the philosophers, of the Enlightenment from Europe, the old world, into the new world. And many of the former colonies, including the Spanish colonies, in the New World bought into this idea of liberty. And you notice that after the Haitian Revolution, all of these Spanish colonies started to throw off the monarchy. Uh, Venezuela, Colombia, and Argentina, Chile, all of them started to demand their freedom. So you can see the Haitian Revolution is an important factor in the Western Hemisphere. And Haiti itself became a refuge for rebels and revolutionaries from the French and Spanish colonies. In fact, Haiti sent ammunition and weapons and soldiers and sailors to help Simon Bolivar to liberate Venezuela. Mind you, after Venezuela had been liberated, Haitians weren't invited to, the conferences and so on. The Venezuelans took the weapons and took the help from the sailors and soldiers, took the ammunition. But Haiti was black, and no amount of weapons could erase that blackness. And they just weren't invited to participate in any other democratic activities by Venezuela. So you can see that the revolution was really faced with a lot of ingratitude from the Hispanic countries, despite the help it had given. And you see now in the West Indies, in the Caribbean, a new society free from slavery being run by non-white former slaves. And of course, many white planters fled. Some went to Cuba, some went to Jamaica, some went to North America. And when you hear about Jamaican grown Blue Mountain coffee, it came from Haiti. When you hear about, tobacco and coffee in Cuba, some of it came from the Haitian planters fled to Cuba and Jamaica and carried some of their slaves with them and carried some of their crops with them. And those two countries, which are, when you look at the map, you see how close Cuba and Jamaica are to Haiti. So the planters fled and established those crops in those countries to which they fled. But the revolutionary government, once it established itself in 1804, 1st of January 1804, it was not greeted, it was not welcomed by the other states in the New World or even the Old World. In fact, it was ostracized by the slave-owning states. France, to start with, extracted huge, exorbitant reparation. France got reparations. So the word is not unknown. France demanded and got reparations from Haiti, and it broke Haitian economy. Up to now, Haiti has not recovered from paying reparations to the French. But they could not trade. The Americans put an embargo on Haiti. It was crippled. France refused to recognize the government. England refused to recognize the government till 1833. United States refused to recognize Haitian government till 1862. Even the Latin republics that Haiti had helped refused to grant it diplomatic recognition. So you can see that hatred against Haiti has been going on for over 200 years. And when you see, a group of 12 or 15 Haitians being mistreated in places like Guyana, you can see that prejudice, was embedded in the Western Hemisphere for over 200 years. Guyana has welcomed 30,000 Venezuelan migrants. People are now arranging medical treatment, educational access. But you find 12 Haitians in a hotel in Skeldon, and the heavens will fall. It's terrible, but we owe a debt to the people, to the revolutionaries of Haiti. So after the triumph of the revolution in 1804, it was ostracized. Haiti had to pay reparations, and it was denied the recognition even from people it helped. So we have a country, Haiti, which was invaded by three empires, but it was battered. It was, the revolution caused widespread disease. death, damage, and destruction. People were destitute from famine and starvation. The population fell from about 500,000 to 250,000. You could imagine that? And most of these were young people who were fighting in the revolution. And of course, the invasions, and the Netherlands, the Dutch people helped the French. The Americans helped the French. And of course, Britain, France, and Spain actually invaded Haiti. So Haiti, really was given, I would say, well, I can't call it a raw deal. It was given the most, damaging treatment, inflicted the most damaging treatment upon it by these three countries, particularly France, Britain, and Spain. But it encouraged revolts in Grenada, same year, 1791. Again, Grenada is very close to Haiti. Curacao, 1795. In Guyana, we had a revolt on West Demerara. In St. Lucia in 1795, in Barbados, 1816, Jamaica, 1831. And in Colombia, Venezuela, all of these revolts were inspired by the Haitian revolt. And in Cuba as well, for several years, from 1825 to 1843. And in America itself, there was a big revolt in Louisiana in 1811. All these were very serious revolts, which were patterned, which were inspired by the Haitian Revolution. Haiti is a bright light in the Caribbean. It is the only instance in which Black people who were enslaved successfully overthrew a white slave society. It created the world's first free Black-led republic in the Western Hemisphere, and is the first independent state in the Caribbean after the United States itself. It is impossible to measure the international impact of the Haitian Revolution on the Caribbean. And all of us should be very grateful. We should remember the United Nations Day, because Haiti, the success of the Haitian Revolution, regardless of the condition the country is in at present. I hope that, these few remarks that I've made this morning help you to understand how Haiti got where it is today and why it is still being treated as a sort of an outcast by some of the states in the Western Hemisphere. But we in countries like Guyana should be proud of the example set by Haiti and the inspiration it gave to rebels in Guyana, particularly in 1895 on the West Coast and 1823 on the East Coast. Thank you, and may God bless you.
Each man must do his